Emancipation from ressentiment. The evolutionary and physiological roots of hurt. Introduction. A brief explanation of the concept of ressentiment and the relevance of the topic. Why modern humans often live in a state of chronic resentment and internal comparison. Ressentiment is a complex emotional cognitive state rooted in the feeling of having an unfairly diminished position in relation to others. It arises when a person feels powerless to directly change a situation, yet retains internal aggression, experiencing it in the form of moral judgment, resentment, or envy. Modern humans live in an environment of constant comparison. Social media, public competition, and the cult of success create a field of continuous evaluation. Who is smarter, richer, more attractive, or more influential? As a result, the psyche of most people remains in a state of hidden stress. Every day, the brain registers countless situations where someone appears better, triggering an ancient resentment response aimed at restoring internal balance. This resentment is rarely recognized directly. More often, it reveals itself through sarcasm, devaluation of others' achievements, moral superiority, or the desire to bring others down. In this way, ressentiment becomes the background of everyday thinking, a kind of biochemical environment of modern consciousness. Chronic immersion in this state weakens the capacity for growth. Instead of striving to improve their real condition, a person focuses on emotional compensation, spending resources on an internal struggle with imaginary opponents. This is why understanding and liberating oneself from ressentiment becomes not only a philosophical task, but also a physiological necessity for maintaining mental health and cognitive clarity. Chapter 1. The Origin of the Term, Historical Roots, Nietzsche and His Critique of Slave Morality. The concept of ressentiment gained philosophical depth in the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, especially in On the Genealogy of Morals. Nietzsche used this term to describe the psychological state from which the so-called slave morality arises, a system of values created by the weak and oppressed as a response to the dominance of the strong. According to Nietzsche, ressentiment is suppressed, hostility transformed into morality. Those who cannot express their strength directly begin to reevaluate values, declaring their weaknesses virtues and condemning strength as evil. This creates a moral justification for powerlessness, where modesty, humility, and suffering are elevated above courage, power, and the joy of life. Thus, in Nietzsche's view, ressentiment is the source of distorted human values, a mechanism through which weakness becomes morally significant and strength becomes criminalized. Ressentiment as a tool for moral compensation of weakness. After Nietzsche, ressentiment began to be viewed not only as a philosophical category, but also as a psychological mechanism of self-protection. When a person feels unable to change their circumstances, the psyche constructs a compensatory system of meaning in which defeat is interpreted as virtue. This strategy protects self-esteem, but simultaneously deprives the individual of the ability to act. Ressentiment becomes an intellectual form of powerlessness. Instead of physical confrontation, an inner rationalization arises, turning weakness into moral superiority. Such a person does not seek strength. They seek to prove that strength itself is immoral. This is the essence of moral compensation. The psyche maintains internal balance, but at the cost of abandoning growth and development. Interpretation in Max Scheler and subsequent philosophers. Max Scheler, in his book Ressentiment, 1912, expanded Nietzsche's ideas by showing that ressentiment is not merely an individual emotion, but a socio-emotional energy capable of shaping entire moral systems. Scheler emphasized that ressentiment arises where an individual cannot openly express their envy or hostility. The emotion does not disappear. It transitions into a latent form, becoming a source of moral norms that regulate society. According to Scheler, ressentiment is a slowly smoldering emotion that has no outlet and therefore transforms into ideology. It may manifest in a cult of equality, glorification of self-sacrifice, condemnation of success and wealth. Later thinkers P. Ricoeur, G. Deleuze, H. Marcuse viewed ressentiment as a psychosocial matrix that generates mass movements, where moral outrage becomes a tool of political or ideological struggle. Modern understanding ressentiment as a socio-biological program for protecting self-esteem. Contemporary interpretations of ressentiment combine philosophical and biological perspectives. Today, it can be understood as an innate mechanism of status protection inherited from primates. When an individual encounters inequality, the brain responds with physiological stress. If direct action is impossible, cognitive defenses appear: devaluation, moral condemnation, rationalization. These responses reduce internal tension and restore a subjective sense of equilibrium. Thus, ressentiment is an unconscious method of maintaining self-esteem within a social hierarchy. It preserves psychological integrity, but traps a person in reactions aimed not at growth, but at emotional compensation. In modern society, where constant comparison has become the norm, ressentiment has transformed from an exception into the everyday background of human thought. Chapter 2: The Evolutionary Roots of Ressentiment. Hierarchical structures in primates. At the core of all primate social behavior lies hierarchy. It determines resource distribution and access to food, mates, and safety. Every individual instinctively senses its place within the group structure. Subordinates display submission, while dominants display strength and control. This hierarchical order has a clear biological purpose. It minimizes open conflict and preserves group stability. Yet it also creates a specific internal state in subordinates, an awareness of inequality accompanied by physiological stress. When status boundaries are violated, primates exhibit emotional reactions similar to the human feeling of hurt. These are not abstract emotions but neurochemical responses aimed at restoring what the organism perceives as a fair balance. Thus, the foundation of ressentiment emerges already at the level of primate perception of social structure. A sense of injustice and behavioral examples, the Capuchin cucumber experiment, one of the most vivid experiments demonstrating the biological origins of ressentiment, is Frans de Waal's study with capuchins. 2 monkeys were asked to perform the same task: hand a stone to the experimenter. As a reward, one received a slice of cucumber, while the other received a grape, a much more desirable treat for capuchins. After a few repetitions, the monkey receiving only cucumber began to show strong dissatisfaction. It threw the cucumber back, refused to participate, slammed the cage wall. This reaction was not to the cucumber itself, but to the perceived unfairness. Such behavior is a primitive form of ressentiment. The monkey cannot rationally explain its displeasure, but its nervous system registers a disruption of status and fairness. In humans, this mechanism has not disappeared. It has simply acquired verbal and cultural expression. Primate hurt as a reaction to status inequality. In primate communities, status inequality is not only tolerated, but constantly challenged. The struggle for position in the hierarchy is accompanied by emotional surges that resemble human feelings of hurt or jealousy. A subordinate that loses access to a resource shows frustration, refusing food, isolating itself, or displaying aggressive gestures. This reaction is biologically adaptive. It signals internal imbalance that requires compensation or new social interaction. Hurt, in this context, is an instinctive attempt to restore justice, even through a display of suffering. Human ressentiment inherits the same dynamic, but moves it into the cognitive domain. We do not throw cucumbers, but we throw moral arguments, sarcasm, and judgments. The behavior becomes cultural, yet its foundation is the same emotional, physiological structure inherited from primates. The shift from physical protest to cognitive compensation in humans. As the human brain developed and became capable of understanding the causes of inequality, direct physical protest became socially dangerous. In its place emerged a cognitive method of compensation: devaluation, rationalization, moral condemnation. While a primate expresses hurt through physical aggression, a human constructs a moral narrative in which the strong are evil and the weak are virtuous. Thus, ressentiment evolved from a reaction into a psychological survival mechanism in a complex social environment. This cognitive transformation of emotion allowed humans to reduce internal tension without engaging in open conflict. Yet it also entrenched a tendency towards self-deception, the creation of an illusion of moral superiority where there is in fact powerlessness. Here lies the critical transition, from biological hurt to intellectual ressentiment, from bodily reaction to ideological construction. Chapter 3: The Physiology of Ressentiment. the involvement of the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. Despite its intellectual veneer, ressentiment has clear physiological mechanisms. It relies primarily on the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, brain structures responsible for emotional reactions and cognitive control. The amygdala is the threat detection center. It reacts instantly to signals of unfairness or humiliation, triggering emotional responses such as irritation, anger, or hurt. This impulse arises long before conscious evaluation of the situation. The prefrontal cortex, by contrast, tries to rationalize this emotional surge and give it meaning. Here begins the transformation of biological hurt into moral judgment. A person justifies the emotion by constructing a narrative. I am right because the other behaved wrongly. Thus, ressentiment is an interaction between the ancient and the modern brain. The amygdala triggers the threat response, and the cortex shapes it into a cognitive form that protects self-esteem. Neurochemical processes: cortisol, adrenaline, dopamine. The physiological basis of ressentiment is reflected in its neurochemical balance. When a person encounters inequality, the stress response system becomes activated. Cortisol heightens anxiety and internal tension, preparing the body for fight or avoidance. Adrenaline increases arousal and readiness for action, even if the action never occurs. Dopamine enters the process later during the rationalization of hurt. When a person finds a moral justification for their negative feelings, the dopamine system rewards them with a sense of internal victory. This creates a paradox. Negative emotions activate stress hormones, but the cognitive justification of these emotions produces temporary relief. As a result, the brain becomes accustomed to the cycle of hurt and self-justification, forming a stable dependence on the state of moral indignation. Bodily manifestations and the effect of chronic tension. Ressentiment is not confined to thought. It becomes embedded in the body. Constant irritation and internal comparison cause increased muscle tension, elevated heart rate, and shallow breathing. The organism lives in a state of readiness for conflict that never arrives. This leads to chronic overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system, gradually wearing down the body. Over time, these states become habitual. A person may appear calm externally, while their body remains locked in a mode of anxious vigilance. Fatigue, apathy, and emotional burnout emerge. Ressentiment transforms from an occasional reaction into a physiological mode of existence, maintaining a permanent level of stress. How the brain creates the illusion of moral superiority to reduce stress. Because direct aggression or open competition for status is often impossible, the brain seeks ways to reduce tension without physical confrontation. One such method is the creation of an illusion of moral superiority. When a person cannot change reality, they change interpretation. The offender becomes immoral, the strong become cruel, the successful become superficial. This is not an attempt at understanding, but a self-regulatory cognitive maneuver. Moral condemnation in this context is not a product of rationality, but a neuropsychological mechanism of stabilization. It temporarily lowers cortisol and restores a sense of control and justice. Yet the effect is short-lived. The real inequality remains, requiring the psyche to reproduce hurt to sustain the illusion of balance. Thus arises the closed cycle of ressentiment, physiologically beneficial but cognitively destructive. It allows one to feel right, but prevents one from becoming stronger. Chapter 4. The Social Evolution of Hurt. How collective ressentiment transforms into ideologies and mass movements. Ressentiment rarely remains a private experience. An emotion shared by many takes on a social form and becomes the source of a unifying ideology. When large groups of individuals experience the same feeling of hurt and powerlessness, a collective energy emerges that demands symbolic expression. Historically, many moral, political, and religious movements grew out of this emotion, converting personal frustration into a public mission. Collective ressentiment produces the narrative. We are the righteous. They are the guilty. This creates a clear moral map of good and evil, simplifying a complex social world. Such ideologies grant participants a sense of strength and purpose, but do not eliminate the internal source of conflict. They merely redirect the physiological energy of hurt into social action, where emotion substitutes for conscious understanding. The mechanism by which a biological reaction becomes a social weapon. The path from an individual emotion to a mass ideology begins with the rationalization of a biological response. Once hurt acquires moral justification, it becomes a legitimate form of. In modern society, this mechanism is actively exploited by political and media institutions. Societies are easily mobilized around hurt, national, social, or cultural. Indignation unites people far more quickly than rational arguments because it engages neurophysiological systems of threat and fairness. Thus, a biological reaction designed to restore individual equilibrium becomes a social weapon for mass influence. It requires no reflection, only emotional involvement. As a result, collective ressentiment becomes an effective tool for shaping large-scale behavior. Examples: class struggle, politics of the offended, moral campaigns online. A classical example of collective ressentiment is the class struggle, in which the hurt of lower classes toward the wealthy transformed into an ideology of justice and revolutionary retribution. The energy of envy and powerlessness found its outlet in a morally justified narrative of necessary violence to restore equality. In the modern world, similar dynamics appear in the politics of the offended. Groups that perceive discrimination transform the feeling of injustice into the core of their identity. Instead of resolving conflict, a culture of perpetual opposition emerges, where victimhood becomes a source of moral superiority. In the digital age, this phenomenon has intensified. Social networks have become arenas of instant ressentiment. Moral campaigns, cancellations, and public shaming are forms of group aggression disguised as justice. The internet has turned an ancient biological emotion into a streaming ideology, fueled by attention algorithms. The emancipation of ressentiment, when hurt demands recognition. Modern society has entered a phase in which ressentiment is not suppressed but encouraged and institutionalized. Emotions once viewed as weakness now demand respect and public acknowledgement. This can be called the emancipation of ressentiment, the liberation of hurt from shame, and its transformation into a political and cultural force. This process has a dual nature. On one hand, it enables previously silenced groups to express long-accumulated pain and demand justice. On the other, it makes hurt the central principle of collective self-awareness, where everyone seeks recognition of their trauma instead of pathways to transcend it. Emancipated ressentiment becomes a form of power through vulnerability. It ceases to be a reaction and becomes a tool of influence, a new moral currency. But the more society rewards hurt, the harder it becomes to develop maturity and self-awareness, for the energy meant for growth continues to be spent on maintaining emotional balance. Chapter 5. Emancipation from Ressentiment. Recognizing the biological origin of hurt as the first step toward freedom. Hurt is not the result of moral weakness, but a reflection of a biological mechanism designed to protect self-esteem. When the organism encounters a loss of status or recognition, it reacts just as an animal excluded from its group would: stress, tension, aggression, and a drive to restore balance. Recognizing this origin is the first step toward inner freedom. Understanding that hurt is neither spiritual nor moral frees a person from fighting it as if it were a personal flaw. Instead, they begin to observe how an ancient evolutionary program unfolds within the body and mind, designed not for truth, but for survival. This understanding does not invalidate the emotion. It returns control. It allows a person to distinguish where the ancient biological impulse is operating and where the conscious I begins. This distinction is the foundation of emancipation from ressentiment, understanding reactivity and separating oneself from its impulses. Reactivity is the automatic response of the nervous system to external stimuli. It is instantaneous, preconscious, and often colored by a sense of threat. In a state of ressentiment, a person is fully identified with their reaction. They do not merely feel hurt, they become the hurt. The path to liberation lies not in suppressing the reaction, but in separating the observer from the one who reacts. This requires awareness, noticing the moment when the inner impulse seeks expression and instead simply observing it. Such awareness creates distance between stimulus and action. When the intellect begins to perceive its own reactivity, that reactivity loses power. A choice appears, not to continue the cycle of self-justification and comparison, but to allow the emotion to pass without turning it into a worldview. Cognitive flexibility as a tool for neutralizing primitive reactions. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to see a situation from multiple perspectives and avoid fixation on a single interpretation, is crucial in the context of ressentiment. When a person can consider events not only from the viewpoint of "I was wronged," but also through biological, social, and cognitive lenses, they cease to be a victim of perception. The emotion does not disappear, but its meaning changes. It becomes information rather than a definition of the self. Flexible thinking neutralizes primitive reactions because it dissolves their main source, tunnel perception. In this state, the intellect becomes capable of integration rather than defense. It learns to use emotion as a signal for self-understanding, not as a weapon against the world. A new form of maturity, transcending emotional hierarchies. True maturity begins where dependence on emotional hierarchies ends. The need to be above, more correct, more significant. This is not indifference, but understanding of the inner struggle for status. To transcend emotional hierarchy means shifting from reactive existence to conscious being. A person stops measuring themselves through others because they see the mechanisms compelling them to do so. They understand that feelings of superiority or hurt are merely biological survival tools that have lost their relevance in a world where intelligence is capable of self-observation. This gives rise to a new form of maturity, liberation from internal competition, the return of energy from the realm of comparison to the realm of understanding. This is the true emancipation from ressentiment, a transition from automaticity to conscious life as a biological intelligence. Chapter 6. Biological Intelligence and the Control of Ressentiment. Ressentiment as a failure in the adaptive system of biological intelligence. Biological intelligence, as a product of evolution, was created not to seek truth or moral justice, but to help the organism adapt to its environment. Its purpose is to minimize threat and maximize internal equilibrium. Yet in complex social systems, this mechanism often malfunctions. Ressentiment is one such malfunction. When intelligence encounters a situation where it can neither attack nor avoid the threat, it resorts to self-deception to preserve psychological integrity. In this sense, ressentiment is not a personal flaw, but a consequence of an adaptive brain strategy that has lost relevance in a symbolic world. Modern humans no longer live in an environment of direct physical struggle, but within a landscape of meanings, statuses, and comparisons. Biological reactions designed for physical danger continue to function, but they are now directed not at protecting the body, but at defending the ego. As a result, intelligence serves emotion rather than the other way around. Gaining control over ressentiment requires reversing this relationship, returning intelligence to the role of observer. Conscious observation of the physiology of the reaction Orion. The first step toward liberation from ressentiment is observing its physiology. Hurt begins not in thoughts, but in the body. The pulse quickens, the chest tightens, internal tension arises. These signals are not enemies, but indicators that ancient programs have been activated. Conscious attention to bodily manifestations interrupts the automatic chain of stimulus, reaction, rationalization. When a person recognizes the biochemical nature of the emotion, it ceases to feel personal. At that moment, hurt loses power because awareness breaks identification with the physiological process. This approach does not require suppressing feelings. On the contrary, it restores control. By observing the reaction, intelligence ceases to be its hostage. This is the beginning of biological self-awareness, the understanding that emotion is not the self, but part of its evolutionary toolkit, the practice of creating a cognitive gap between stimulus and interpretation. Once observation becomes stable, a second step becomes possible, the creation of a cognitive gap. Between an external event and its interpretation lies a tiny moment in which intelligence can intervene. This moment usually goes unnoticed. The brain instantly assigns meaning to what is happening, coloring it with emotion. The practice of the cognitive gap involves holding attention in the pause where interpretation has not yet formed, but the reaction has already begun. This micro-moment of awareness breaks the automatic operation of the biological program. In it, a person stops being a reactive organism and becomes an observing intelligence capable of choosing the direction of their internal response. With each repetition, this skill weakens the power of ressentiment, redirecting energy from the realm of suffering into the realm of understanding. Consciousness as a tool for emancipation from the monkey within. Consciousness is the only mechanism capable of surpassing biological limitations. It does not eliminate emotions, but changes their status from unconditional commands to objects of observation. In this sense, awareness is not a spiritual practice, but an evolutionary tool for transcending reactivity. Emancipation from ressentiment is, essentially, emancipation from the monkey within, from the part of the brain that evaluates the world through hierarchies, threats, and comparisons. Once intelligence recognizes the source of these reactions, it no longer follows them automatically. Consciousness does not fight biology, it takes it under management. This is the mature form of biological intelligence, a state in which ancient programs serve conscious aims rather than controlling behavior from within. Such a person no longer lives inside emotional hierarchy because they understand its nature. Conclusion. Ressentiment is not a moral failing but an evolutionary inheritance. Ressentiment should not be viewed as a moral flaw or a defect of personality. It is part of our evolutionary inheritance, a product of long-term adaptation aimed at preserving status and internal equilibrium in a social environment. This emotion helped our ancestors survive when direct confrontation with stronger individuals could mean death. But in the modern world, where physical struggle has been replaced by symbolic interaction, these ancient mechanisms operate out of inertia. Feelings of unfairness, envy, or humiliation rarely have practical value today, yet the brain continues to respond as if survival depends on them. Understanding this removes guilt and opens the path to awareness. A person stops seeing hurt as a personal deficiency and begins to recognize it as an automatic biological process that can be observed, studied, and transformed. Liberation from ressentiment lies not in suppressing emotions, but in understanding their nature. Attempts to suppress ressentiment only increase inner tension. A suppressed emotion does not disappear. You simply push it into the unconscious, where it continues to influence behavior in hidden forms. True liberation begins with understanding the physiological and cognitive nature of the reaction. When a person observes hurt as a neuroprocess, a combination of hormonal surges, muscular contractions, and habitual patterns of thought, personal identification dissolves. The emotion is no longer perceived as me, but as the dynamics of a biological system. This perspective does not destroy feelings. It shifts them into a realm of conscious control. One no longer fights oneself, but begins to understand oneself as a biological intelligence whose reactions can be guided rather than blindly enacted. Emancipation from ressentiment is the shift from primitive reactivity to conscious existence of biological intelligence. Emancipation from ressentiment is not a moral improvement, but a qualitative leap of consciousness. It represents a transition from automatic reacting to reflective understanding, from biological necessity to intellectual freedom. When intelligence stops serving emotion and begins observing it, an internal shift occurs. Energy once spent on inner conflict becomes available for growth and insight. This is how a new form of maturity emerges. A person no longer lives in a state of constant comparison and struggle for symbolic superiority. They see how biological programs attempt to govern them, and they remain above those mechanisms. This is the conscious existence of biological intelligence, a state in which a person is no longer a hostage of their evolution, but its continuation.